I'm Shanice Henry, editor of Pharma IQ. I'm here on site at Disposable Solutions for Biomanufacturing 2017 conference. I'm here to find out about a few of the burning topics that the industry is facing, and I spoke to a few thought leaders to find out more.
Okay, so we'd like to start off this afternoon with a panel discussion with three of the speakers we had from this morning, so Aidan, Patrick and Michael, who you've already met. So I've had a couple of questions, but clearly if people got more questions, we'll feed through that. So I thought one of the ways of kicking this off is actually trying to understand what in the audience people aren't using single-use systems for. So I was going to guess, is there actually people here who aren't actually using single-use systems in their process facilities at all? I guess, Brand, none. They're not using it. How many actually, I was going to say, is start from the far end, is more if people using these for more the drug product manufacturing, or is it drug substance? Is there, who's using it for drug product? Okay. Reasonable number. And drug substance? Probably more, slightly more, I guess. And the question is more, as we'll go through the panel, is what people think about implementations. Is there any actual questions people have had from the floor about how you might go and the challenges are actually implementation of single-use systems?
So in the business that I work in, we make monoclonal antibodies, and the site that I work on does the manufacture of the protein and the purification of the protein and the packing into a long-term storage container of the protein that we will, which has been formulated. So there are no further steps when it gets to the fill site bar the filling operation. So that protein is formulated drug substance, and it's frozen in bulk in 1 or 10 litre volumes essentially, and it's held for a number of years, right, in the frozen bulk, and then it goes to one of our filling facilities. So clearly, up to the end of the UFDF stage, in the case of a monoclonal antibody, we have the possibility of removing leachable species from the process stream. So we had a lot of discussion today about leachables and things like that. And my role, part of my role at least, is to assess that risk by a mechanism similar to the calculation that I showed you earlier, where I calculate the leachable propensity or leachable risk score. And then in the Janssen world, for the components we identify as high risk, they go on to the material sciences group, who evaluate the potential risk based on the extraction profile. So that's one aspect of using single-use components. So we do this assessment of the risk at 2 different stages, and we have the same approach at our filling sites. So we have that leachables part of the risk, but then we also have the qualification of the single-use component when we want to bring it to site first. So at that point in time, I'll also do a similar calculation based on our planned use of, for example, a filter. Where are we going to use a microbial retentive filter in the process? And the other things that we will look at as part of the introduction of the single-use technology, for example, a storage bag or a mixing bag, is what's the microbial integrity of that bag? If I store a buffer solution in that bag for 2 months, will it continue to reach its release test criteria to allow it to be used in the process? If I carry out a mixing step, how do I know that when I take a sample from a process single-use bag, a single-use mixer, how do I know that that's a representative sample? Because we generate the data. So those are some of the other components that we would be looking at in terms of the complexity of introducing single-use technology to site. So I'll just pass along to my colleagues here. So you're next.
Okay, I'll try to be a little bit briefer, sorry. So for me, there are three main technical challenges for single-use, which are integrity, which are extractables and leachables, and which are particulates. Especially critical for my company, because we've been using single-use for a little bit more than 10 years now, trying to modernize our manufacturing processes, moving from the old-fashioned grade A laminar flow open processes to closed systems processes. And the single-use is the royal route for that. Aside of the technical points, I think key questions are more on the business side, guarantee of supply, supply chain management, and one thing which is the biggest concern for us for more than 10 years now is quality of supply. Because every time we have an issue in quality of supply, the impact on our operation is absolutely tremendous. And as we've implemented single-use in hugely critical applications, because that's where they brought really value to close our processes, when we discover we have an issue, especially on integrity of systems, and that issue can be valid for 3, 4, 5 manufacturing batches, we are close to freeze all the company. And that's something we need to work, and we've been working constantly with the suppliers. I'm very happy because mid of this year, major suppliers will implement a control strategy that we've been pushing constantly for 10 years, and that is now coming alive. And that will, I hope, securize a bit our processes and our applications.
Well, mine's more sort of a question than anything else, but I assume that from the point of view of logistics, etc., and cost, as you build up your experience, you will try and stay with systems that you have experience with, because you then know pretty much what to expect out of them from the point of view of bleachables, for example, and as long as the quality and the supply remains okay, you're going to use your knowledge so you don't have to redo everything each time you have a new product coming through, if it's similar enough to that. So this is like getting a portfolio of your actual packaging systems which you're going to package with, that you have your vendors, and what you need from them, which is what Patrick was sort of saying, is, well, you don't need a surprise. And by that I mean on a plastic one, that they've suddenly changed the formulation of what one of the plastics they have as a component or all across the board. And the time when you find out about this is when something promptly goes wrong. And so when is a change not a change, and all these wonderful little senses, or when should somebody inform you of a change? And that's, for plastics, is always a bit of a grey area. I always used to worry about that, especially getting my plastics for a container closure system for packaging, in that because I was at the short end of the chain, in other words, I only bought a truckload and the train load went to actually giving some nice Japanese headlights, that when they want to change something, they'll do it for the one who pays the big bucks, which is not us. You know, we don't use enough of the quantity, and they may not tell you. Don't rely on a DMF. I mean, that's my experience. So there's always a bit of a concern with plastic materials that we might not be informed ahead of time of something which is relevant to us but not really thought of or relevant to the plastic material vendor.
And that's why you have to choose your plastic resin suppliers.
And just to add to that, we had a situation just last year where we were notified very, very late of a change in a resin supplier from one of our suppliers of single-use components. And actually, it was serious enough that we were going to have to shut down production next week if we couldn't get certain types of information and make our assessments based on those changes, you know, so it is very, very serious. The other thing I just wanted to add was I have seen in the past, just because you have a particular supplier, it doesn't mean that they make the component exactly the same on multiple sites. And actually in a previous existence, with a particular component we were using, which came from site A, they said, well, we've actually run out of stock in site A and we don't have that component to supply you with, but take it from site B. It's the exact same component and there are no differences. And then we took the component from site B on the understanding that it was the exact same component, but it actually turned out it wasn't the same, right? There was a different cross-linking agent used in the manufacturing process on the second site, and they said, don't worry about it, we'll get the USP Class 6 testing done and everything will be fine. And when they did the testing, it actually killed the test mice, right? So that's pretty serious, okay? You don't want to be putting that in your... Yeah, so it was a very big concern for us, and we ended up having to change every soft part on our site as a result, you know, just to address that issue. So I don't know if you guys want to add anything.
No, I mean, it is our concern in our industry that this can happen. And you were slightly lucky that you found out beforehand, because it can happen that basically it goes out into patients, or you've made some batches and then you find out, and then you're in a hole for a lot of money and time and all the rest of it. So you've got to trust your vendor, but honestly, sometimes things slip through. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry. In this particular case, we had actually used it on a couple of batches of product, and also other manufacturers had done the same, right? So it was affecting more than one manufacturer of pharmaceutical product.
What I was going to ask as well in terms of implementation is...
Hi, for those that, I'm John Bain from CPC. I'm also the chairman with BPSA. And I think the change notification or examples we had here speak to why, you've heard BPOG and Mike referenced BPOG and BPSA working together on a change group. And those are the types of examples that have happened in the industry, and there are others, right, that we've all learned from. So there's a cross-functional team that's been meeting for well over a year. They've had an initial publication. They'll have another publication coming out this year, and I know within BPOG and within BPSA, the intent is that the industry players the whole way through the supply chain, from resin through components through system suppliers, are working towards having a consistent and integrated approach for change control, so that if there was a resin change or if we changed a connector, that we would be sending out a notification to the various players in the industry. And if we sent it to an integrator, they would take our information and it would go into a form that looked the same, so that there would be consistency of what we're going to notify people on and how we're going to notify them and what kind of time frame that we would notify on different types of changes. So I don't disagree with any of the examples. I think this is an example of how as an industry we're learning from our past. Patrick and I talked about that at lunch. And so this is just like particulates as an example where we've noticed and realized there are things that are going to impede single use as a manufacturing platform, and those are the types of things that make sense for the various organizations in the industry to work together on. So a lot of progress on change is happening. Obviously, it can't happen fast enough.
I guess one thing I was going to pick up on as well is it's kind of feeds into vendor choice as well. As Aidan mentioned earlier this morning about phase-based approaches to adoption and use of single-use systems. And I think I might throw the question out again. How many people are actually using the products for in-market use out here? For actual licensed products? Or are you using the single-use systems more for production of material for clinical trials and clinical studies? Could I have had, who's using it for clinical studies? And who's in market? So a reasonable number, I guess, and I think it's how you adapt. What I was going to ask the question is more of, clearly as you go through that phase, you might be able to tighten regulations and do more testing. What you don't want to obviously do is change systems, and I guess the question out to the panel really is, how do you go about developing systems not to do that?
So, Tony, just to react on that and to clarify the level of criticality, we are transporting bulk drug product in single use for 10 years now for my company, from the bulk site to the filling site, in liquid form, not in frozen form.
So I think just to expand on Tony's question there, the example that I showed you of the phased approach clearly shows that when we move into phase 3 and on to PV and commercialization, that's where we look at making sure that we have our leachables data and assessment starting off, and that we have assessed all the extraction data that we have for those components. And as I mentioned earlier, and I'll try not to be as long-winded this time, we do carry out that leachables risk scoring when we bring a new component to site, or into the network for all of our sites. So if we have, again, a filter is a good example. If we bring in a new filter for a specific product that's in early phase manufacturing, like phase 1 or 2, we would still carry out that risk scoring because we're introducing a new material to our site. It doesn't have to be what we would consider to be a fully qualified material at this point in time, but at least we shouldn't have any flags showing up that indicate that we couldn't qualify it in the future based on the extraction data, that there's nothing objectionable present. Okay?
Well, we'll see in a second. I mean, that also includes something which we don't normally quite think about, is that quite often you have made your drug product, but you're not going to fill it in the facility that you actually have made it in. It's either going to be stored or shipped to another facility, which may be in the same country. So take the example, it's going from Cork to Dublin. But many times it's going, say, from the US to Europe, and that used to be to Puerto Rico, but then they changed the tax laws and we pulled out of Puerto Rico. And so the agency, I'm sure the European authorities are the same, are really hot on what the container is that you're shipping and the shipping conditions, and on analysis of your product when it reaches the other end, and whole loads of detail. If it's going to go by air, if there's any issues there, temperature, etc. So I mean, just don't think that it finishes when you've made the drug product. If you're shipping it somewhere else for the next stage, you've got to worry about that as well.
Yeah, and one of the things that we've seen, again, kind of an emerging concern, I guess, is a lot of bulk drug product is shipped in polycarbonate bottles, right? If you're shipping those in dry ice, there's some level of concern being raised about the CO2 actually going through the polycarbonate material. So it doesn't just stop with the E&L stuff, right? Even though that's what a lot of us are interested in. The other things that we've been challenged on recently have been how do we know that we're not contaminating our process with endotoxin as a result of using single-use component? Or how are we showing that we're not putting our process at microbial risk? And the regulators are looking for us to do more than just have validated irradiation processes for these components. So Alan, have you a comment on that?
Oh, clearly, for us, and it's really starting at our user requirement specifications, we draw what's the requirement linked to our product or intermediate product, And then we assess that, okay, do we need to get full guarantee on sterility? What level of guarantee do we need to have on endotoxins and on other aspects like that, like particulates too? Basically, endotoxin is another facet of the cleanliness of your system.
Yes, does the audience have any comments or questions? Gentleman right, unfortunately, at the back. Can we meet you halfway?
Hello, Ken Gavin from Malima Sensors. There's another industry that is also very particular about its suppliers, and that's the semiconductor industry. And anybody who's dealt with semiconductor would be familiar with words like, or phrases like copy exactly. In the semiconductor industry, a lot of them expect their suppliers to be able to repeat endlessly the products that they supply them. They also expect their suppliers to make sure that their sub-suppliers also go through the same rigorous. So it goes on and on and on. And the other thing that they also do is whenever there's any annual maintenance being carried out, they want to be notified because they want to make sure that that annual maintenance happens exactly like it did the last time, and so that they don't end up having excursions in their factory because of a major piece of preventative maintenance being done. Okay.
Thank you, and you're quite right. However, to what I said earlier, I always have the feeling that our use of plastic materials in the medical industry, we're at the short end of the stick, and we're not driving the real sales of it. We just on a small part of it, and therefore the needs of the big sales from a lot of these basic manufacturers, their eyes are on something else, and we need vigilance, as Aidan said, all the time to make sure something isn't slipping through. And then the famous surprise. We're all going to get surprises occasionally. We're just going to have to be able to deal with it as best we can.
So you're right. Pharma industry must learn from other mass production industries like semiconductors, but also, I personally believe, automotive industry. We don't leverage enough. You cannot imagine what is the level of requirements for a fuel distribution system and an fuel injection system in the automotive industry. The smallest particle you can have will completely explode the system at 1,200 bars. So definitely they have extremely high level requirements for mass production parts. So we should learn from that. That's first comment. Second comment, I'm very happy that you confirm, and that was part of my presentation, maintenance is a key element, and we need to look for that. Last point about raw material suppliers, there has been for years now some kind of differentiation in the industry. Some people just trying to make money from the pharma industry, and that's all. These are the raw material suppliers which are on the top of my blacklist. And other ones that want to partner with us, that are creating a pharma portfolio of material they try to reinforce some kind of warranty on purity, cleaning procedures, specific shipping equipment to guarantee minimum contamination and so on. And these are the ones I was having in mind when I was mentioning we need to choose our raw material suppliers.
Okay, so I've been given a couple of questions from the floor. The first one is, with numerous standards and guidelines being created, what are the future plans to align, and ultimately, which should take precedence?
Okay, I'll try and be brief again. I guess there's a difference between a standard and a guideline and regulation, okay? So to my mind, for the most part, adopting a standard and saying we're going to employ this standard and use that standard that's largely pretty optional, notwithstanding Michael's comments earlier about the ASTM in the US environment. Guidelines would be the same. You can adopt a guideline like the baseline guides for the ISPE as an example, right? Or GAMP. Now, generally they kind of find their way into best practices almost by creep or by stealth, right? But you don't have to comply with these. However, you must comply with the regulations and the relevant part of the regulations. And occasionally, a regulation will refer to a standard, right? So you have Annex 1, which is about sterile manufacturing, which anybody who's in this room who's involved in biotech is pretty familiar with, I would imagine. And it specifically calls out ISO 14644, which is an air quality standard for design and maintenance and operation of clean rooms. So to comply with the annex, which is part of the European regulation, you must also apply the methodology laid out in the standard. So ideally, you would have fewer and fewer guidance documents and standards being produced, you know, that there's one kind of global document that we can all comply with. And several groups and agencies like ICH and others have endeavoured to try and drive a standardised approach. But I don't think we're quite getting there yet.
I'll look at it in a slightly different way from the point of view of global standardization, if I could even say it. So from the point of view of Pharmacopoeias, yes, I'll be brief, Tony, pretty much each Pharmacopoeia is owned by the country of its origin. And so you can influence them by putting a change to Pharmacopoeia like USP comes out. And it depends on your relationship with the Pharmacopoeia of country X, Y, and Z. And it varies. We have a very good relationship with the Japanese Pharmacopoeia, and we're developing one with the Chinese Pharmacopoeia, which is, they in essence are actually writing it now. But otherwise, you know, for global alignment, it's up to other countries to borrow from the European Pharmacopoeia or borrow from the USP. Will we ever get to total harmonization? No. Alignment is the correct term because that leaves flexibility. Harmonization does not. So it will take time just generally globally anyway, never mind in the USA.
I think we've got about a couple of minutes left. So the final question I've got is, if guidelines are not essential, how can suppliers be penalized for not providing the data?
It's up to the end user to choose the good partners.
How can you be penalized? Very easily, not convincing the FDA. Yeah, that's the USP, well, the American answer. So you have to know your regulators. It's not very helpful. And we all know that regulators vary between HQ and the field, which is usually a bit of a nuisance on a disconnect. But if you're going to convince anybody, convince HQ first and then get them to try and work with their local offices on something new as well, as was where we really are, is fairly new, especially to the local offices.
Yeah, and just to echo Patrick's point, we will select the suppliers that give us the information we want about their products and maintain good control of their own changes that they're making or their own suppliers are making. And we did have a point earlier that we are a very small part of the overall polymers industry, right? I think I saw a slide in the last few months where probably 5% or less, you know? So that's one of our challenges.
Okay, so thank you for that. So can I thank all the panel members, Aidan, Patrick, Michael, for that. Thank you very much.
Well, it's a very diverse array of talks you can listen to, and it's very hard to find anywhere else people from all kinds that bring together all kinds of perspectives to the table. So all along the supply chain, you get analytical viewpoint, manufacturing viewpoint, engineering, and so on. It's a very terrific mixture of talks and opportunities to network.
It's a great opportunity for me to do some kind of benchmark, to understand what others end users are doing, to compare and to understand what are the development in single use. Also, it's a great opportunity to understand from a regulatory standpoint how the situation is evolving, and also to liaise with suppliers so that we can better discuss together, understand each other, and work together to improve our single-use systems.
Different companies have products out on their tables to look at. Has been really interesting. Some really innovative technologies are being shown here today, and it really shows the scope of new products and innovation being driven in the single-use industry. So it's been a great show, and I'm really enjoying being here.
It's been a great couple of days here at Disposable Solutions for Biomanufacturing 2017, here based in Munich. And we've had some great insights from industry thought leaders. If you'd like to know more, go to pharmaiq.com.